Alkan was French, of Jewish ancestry. That was reflected partly in some of his compositions.
Alkan's father was called Alkan Morange. Alkan was born Charles-Valentin Morange, but he took his father's name of Alkan, and in fact he had 5 brothers, and they all called themselves Alkan.
Yes, he had 5 brothers and 1 sister, and they were all prodigiously talented musicians and developed careers of their own within music in Paris. Alkan was the eldest and far and away the most extraordinarily gifted.
At the age of 6, he obviously must have completed his ordinary scholastic studies, and he started at the Paris Conservatoire at the age of 6. And in a way, he graduated at 7½. He got premier prix for something called solfège, a sort of sight singing, which is horrendously difficult, in fact. He then started the piano, got first prize for piano at 11. And Rossini, who was not very easily taken in or influenced, he described him as that wonderful child, and he was looked upon as second Mozart. But by 15, he was considered one of the leading virtuosi in Paris. He moved into the very fashionable Square d'Orléans, where Alexander Dumas lived, Zimmermann, his former teacher, lived, and was soon joined by Chopin and Georges Sand. In fact, he and Chopin became next-door neighbours, great friends. They used to go to the opera together, they used to go to cabaret together, and of course they were also, he became very closely associated with Liszt. And he and Liszt played on the concert platform together. I suppose Liszt was, 26, and Alkan was about 24. There's an extraordinary description of Alkan, Chopin, Zimmermann, and Gutmann, the dedicatee of Chopin's Third Scherzo. They all played Alkan's transcription for 8 hands of Beethoven's 7th Symphony. Now, it's a very sad letter from Chopin about 2 years later. Dear Alkan, I'd love to play the 7th again, but I don't feel strong enough.
Yes, he did seem to fit in remarkably well with his contemporaries. There was a concert in which he took part at a young age with Liszt performing, and also with an even younger César Franck, making his debut at the age of 14, I think. And he was, of course, accepted very much as an equal with all of these names, and seemed to be going on to present himself as a virtuoso pianist of some distinction. And even quite early on in his 20s, he made the, what seems in light of his later life, rather daring attempt to break into the international scene by coming to London. He had, in fact, 2 trips to London, and as far as I'm aware, they're the only times that he left Paris.
So he was very, very much in the midst of things, and of course the French musical fraternity had very, very high hopes. He was their leading pianist, and soon one of their most promising composers.
His early works, as far as I can ascertain, the few of them that I've seen were extremely virtuosic and not terribly substantial, I'm afraid to say. The first significant ones, I believe, are the 2 concerti da camera. Those have considerable charm, I think, and could very well be placed alongside the Hummel concerti, for example, which are performed from time to time. And they certainly do not deserve the neglect that they have been subjected to. The first really substantial work, I think, that took him out of his pen, aside from certain sets of studies, was the Sonata, Opus 33, which I believe is from 1846. And I can understand that this particular work, the Sonata, did not appeal too much to pianists, because it contains, among other things, a 9-voice fugato that takes hours and hours and days and weeks of study in order to bring it off.
about the age of 24, he seemed to be on the crest of the wave of fame and everything that goes with it. And suddenly, the shutters come down, and he becomes a recluse.
I think that there seems to be almost a persecution mania about the way he viewed certain events in his life. There were two specific times. First of all, the publication of his Grand Sonata, which is by any terms a major landmark in 19th century music. And unfortunately, and one has to say unfortunately in many cases in Alkan's life, the timing wasn't right. And this publication was almost straight away ruined because Paris was then thrown into revolution in 1849. So his grand opus, if you like, was almost totally ignored. The other event, which seems to have been a major thorn in his side, really, was his attempt to be given the job of the head of piano at the Paris Conservatoire, which he felt was his by right.
He was a pupil of Zimmermann. Zimmermann taught everybody under the sun, César, Alkan, of course, he was his favourite pupil, and later on the young Bizet. Zimmermann was the head of the piano faculty in the Conservatoire. And he decided to retire in 1848. And Alkan was the obvious person to get the job.
However, there were three other candidates, all three of which he very apparently considered to be markedly inferior to himself. In fact, the job was eventually given to his pupil, which was really rubbing his nose in it as far as he was concerned. And instead of throwing this aside and maybe saying, well, that's life, it seems to have been an opportunity for him to once again disappear from public view. He seems to have disappeared from Paris life for years at a time. And what was going on during all of that time must have been a re-evaluation of everything that he and his contemporaries were trying to express in musical terms. The early works are pretty much in the same line as many of his contemporaries, rather showy, facile sets of variations and encore pieces. But there are gaps in his performing career during which he must have been beginning to write these more distinctive works, and an altogether different style of musical language becomes apparent almost straight away. It seems like suddenly the artifice of these virtuoso pieces has been taken away, and in its place there is a much more inquiring musical language.
I associate him most closely with Berlioz. But Alkan, curiously enough, did not like Berlioz. He found him to be rather unimaginative. It's interesting to see that the composer Kaykozuru Sorabji also compared him to Berlioz, talking about the sonatine for piano, saying that it sounded like a Beethoven sonata written by Berlioz. To me, there's another name that comes to mind, and that's Schubert. Simply because, like Schubert, Alkan was able to create very tragic moods with an extraordinary economy of means.